Your Excellency, Mr. President of the General Assembly, dear friends, I am Zeid Hussein, President of the International Peace Institute, and I'm honored to be co-hosting this event with Open Society Foundations, and we're absolutely thrilled and honored that President Malcolm Brown is with us today. This event will present new findings from the Open Society Foundation's global poll, which surveyed respondents across 30 countries on issues related to democracy, human rights, multilateralism, and more. And the findings will be presented to us. And so we welcome you all most warmly to this event. And we also take this opportunity to welcome our online audience. IPI has been engaged on debates on the state of multilateralism and the multilateral system for many years, and most especially since it was the Secretariat for the Independent Commission on Multilateralism from 2014 to 2016. At that time, the question was, is the system fit for purpose to address the great challenges of the 21st century? But over the last 10 years, the question has shifted. Increasingly, the question has become, is the system on the verge of collapse? Are the forces of fragmentation so strong that the UN-based multilateral system is at risk of becoming irrelevant? And what of all the critical and collective issues that are not being addressed or attended to by the components of the system, the states themselves and their leadership? The Open Society Foundation's global poll will help us get a better picture of all of this. And since 2019, IPI has also been developing the Multilateralism Index, which analyzes the multilateral system based on 65 indicators across 3 dimensions: participation, performance, and inclusivity, and 5 domains: peace and security, human rights, environment, public health, and trade. Among the findings, perhaps to no one's surprise, is that the performance of the multilateral system entered a period of decline between 2010 and 2020 in 4 out of the 5 dimensions. Only global public health registered an improvement in performance during this period, and there were broad improvements in measurements of inclusivity and mixed results on participation. Naturally, this finding regarding public health came just prior to the COVID pandemic, which sort of crystallized in all our minds the predicament that we face. And having President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf with us, who led or co-chaired the independent panel, is for us a great benefit today, and we'll hear from her shortly. For all of us, I mean, we realize that the pandemic should never have happened, that it did and released this energy of creativity in the form of a vaccine, and the technology behind it was astonishing, amazing. But what was not amazing, of course, was the vaccine distribution and the inequities that came with it. And then the deaths that accompanied all of this was appalling. Of course, many countries had wrecked economies as well and are still suffering from it. And yet, at the core of all of this is, at the heart of all of this, are people who rely on the very systems that we have set up to manage and regulate and improve their lives. And if we ask what people want, surely they want positive results, more positive results, and we need to find new and better ways to deliver those results to them. It is now my great privilege and pleasure to invite His Excellency, Mr. Dennis Francis, the President of the General Assembly, to address us on these issues. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Madam President Sirleaf Johnson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Let me begin by expressing my deep appreciation to the International Peace Institute and to Open Society Foundations for co-organizing this generous invitation on a rather timely theme befitting the current realities. It is indeed an honor to be among such distinguished panelists and before an audience so well versed in the dynamics shaping our multilateral system today. As you know, world leaders will soon gather in New York for the annual General Assembly's high-level week and general debate. I have invited them to reflect upon the theme, rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. On the one hand, this theme reflects the current shape of our multilateral system at a time of cascading global challenges, from climate change and conflict to poverty and debt crisis in developing countries. On the other hand, it reflects my firm belief that only through cooperation and coordination and an unshakable dedication to multilateralism can we strengthen the basis for delivering global peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. My ambition for the General Assembly is therefore simple: that the UN's most representative body should tackle these issues in the most just, effective, and inclusive manner possible. How do we do this? Allow me very briefly to propose 3 starting points. First, all our efforts in the General Assembly must be anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, our charter. If we are to restore trust in and within the United Nations, as relevant and important as it is, preaching about values will never be enough alone. The General Assembly must lead by example, by practicing what it preaches as global norm setter, by grounding our decisions in the UN Charter, and by vehemently denouncing behavior that violates its cherished tenets. Second, we must take a fresh look at collaboration across the UN system. People around the world do not view the UN as separate entities. They see one United Nations, one organization that must deliver on its historic pledge to create a world that is more safe, more just, and more prosperous for all. The methods we employ to solve today's challenges must be equally up to the task. The veto initiative, which mandates the General Assembly to convene a formal debate each time a veto is cast in the Security Council, has opened the door to greater transparency and accountability. Yesterday afternoon, I convened the first formal debate under my presidency in regard to the situation in Mali. This innovative initiative plays a pivotal role in bringing the 2 key organs of our institutions closer together. We must continue to explore other avenues for greater efficiency, system-wide coherence, and cohesion. And I ask, are there other ways the General Assembly can increase meaningful and complementary engagement? The answer is, of course, yes, it can, provided there is genuine political will by and among the membership. Our third and final starting point must center on inclusion. It is imperative that our multilateral system and the institutions within it are built for the advancement of all peoples. Effective multilateralism must be inclusive and responsive. This means empowering and engaging both women and men, communities both large and small, stakeholders near or far, urban or rural, north and south. Not one or the other, not some over others. By involving all actors in global decisions, young people, women and girls, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, older persons, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups, we can better ensure peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all populations. As President of the General Assembly, I take this challenge to heart. I have therefore appointed a special advisor on gender equality and women's empowerment to advance these issues across our deliberations with the aim of shifting entrenched systems of inequality. I have also assumed, and I'm very proud to say this, an important role as a gender champion. More broadly, I pledge to engage with all member states, regional and other groups, as well as with civil society and other key stakeholders in full transparency and inclusivity to foster a renewed spirit of cooperation and conciliation in the General Assembly. Colleagues, I thank you once more for the opportunity to engage with you, and I look forward to hearing your views on these critical issues and engaging in a productive discussion on how we can bolster our collective efforts at the UN and beyond. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, thank you for that fine opening statement. And perhaps this is belated, but we congratulate you, of course, on your election. And we hope that you consider this to be your second podium anytime you wish to express an opinion. So thank you for that. We will now move to the panel part of our discussion, and we are thrilled to have such a distinguished panel. The first panelist will be Lord Mark Malloch Brown, President of Open Society Foundations, known to all of us also as a former UN Deputy Secretary General and Administrator of UNDP, and a long CV related to the UN as well. And Mark will focus on the key findings of the global poll and the insights on what they mean for the future of good governance, international cooperation, finance for climate change and debt and human rights. After Mark, we will turn to Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former President of Liberia, Nobel Peace Laureate, former Chair of ECOWAS, founder of the Ellen Johnson Presidential Center for Women and Development, and former co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness Response, and also co-chair of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Panel on Effective Multilateralism, HLAB. And we've asked the President to share her views on rebuilding trust in multilateral institutions and processes and recommendations for reform of the international system following the report of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. After the President, we will turn to Her Excellency Maritza Chan, Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the UN. And we've asked Maritza to share her views on mobilizing multilateral action in the face of existential threats. In other words, how Costa Rica and other small states have worked together to make the UN-based multilateral system more open and democratic. And finally, we will turn to Ms. Meghna Abraham, Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And we've asked Meghna about how we uphold and promote human rights and how this can help us attend to and address global crises, the global crises of our time. In particular, we've asked her to share strategies which will incorporate civil society organizations and how they can deploy their immense power to address economic inequalities of our time, the economic inequalities of our time. With that, I will stop talking now, and I'm happy to hand over the floor to Mark. I've been told we have to limit this to 7 minutes, but since all of you will be making profound points, we may have to be a little bit flexible and elastic on that. So please, Mark.
This is the UN, after all, when it comes to speaking times. Mr. President, Madam President, Prince Zeid, future President, and I think in that great phrase, which unfortunately in my current job I only too little get to observe all protocols observed. But friends, above all friends, and it's so nice to see friends of many, many years and decades in this room, and also to see my colleagues who've worked so hard on this report here as well. So thank you all. When I was here at the UN as a lieutenant of Kofi's, the phrase "we the peoples" was probably the one that echoed most frequently through the halls of the UN and through rooms like this. And it was a phrase which he'd rescued, after all, from the Charter to remind us that the UN ultimately was not just an institution of states, but of people as well. And I think that's, in a sense, what inspires the link in this poll between democracy and multilateralism, because, you know, multilateralism is a common property of all member states of the UN. It's not one limited to its democracies, but a lot of its energy, a lot of its shaping, a lot of its purpose has come from those democracies. Initially, the democracies who were the victors of the Second World War, but subsequently those who, through decolonization and other means, came to expand the membership of the UN and made the General Assembly a force for representation of all the world of this institution and democratic representation so important. And therefore, I think that our President of the General Assembly this year uses the phrase rebuilding trust as his purpose and mission is one that we can all rally behind. I hear the phrase "we the peoples" returning to its proper prominence at the UN. Governments have held sway for much too long, in my view. But let me turn quickly to this poll. And I'm very, very proud as president of OSF that we have commissioned what is now the second annual poll on the barometer or state of democracy and multilateralism, in which we intend to make an annual feature going forward. And the first point to make is that democracy's death has been perhaps prematurely reported. This poll of 36,000 people in 30 countries representing 5.6 billion of the world's population shows that 86% of those, and remember this poll included countries such as China, which are not democracies, that 86% of respondents wanted to live in a democratic state, and that only 20% believe that authoritarian countries are more capable than democracies to deliver what citizens want. A further 71% agreed that human rights reflect the values that I believe in, But, and always with these things there's a big but, they're not seeing their lives improve. They're seeing growing insecurity and risk in their lives. They're not seeing ultimately democracy or indeed other forms of government delivering for them. Some 49% of respondents said they'd struggled to feed themselves and their families in the past year. And 58% said they feared political violence in the next year. Remarkably, 2/3 of those polled in both the US and France claimed that. And, you know, there were alarming figures about trust in local and national politicians, especially low in some countries like Argentina, Colombia, Japan, Senegal. And a plurality of those we polled said human rights do not protect me and my family. So while there is a great faith in the concept of democracy, it's offset by people's doubts that it's delivering for them. And the further down you go in the age scale, the more those doubts rise. So whereas 71% of our respondents aged above 56 felt that democracy is the preferable form of government, in the 18 to 35 age group, it fell to just 57%. And twice the number of young over old believed in army rule. And so, people are willing to trade in the values and benefits of democracy if another form of government will deliver for them in terms of putting bread on the table, a job, healthcare for their families, etc. But to go beyond that to the implications for multilateralism, which we also asked about. And, coming into the General Assembly week, as we were reminded by the President of the General Assembly, there is a real clear message. There's a huge majority in favor of collective action on shared global problems. 68% said that high-income countries should give more money to the World Bank to support developing countries. 71% wanted to compensate low-income countries for damage due to climate change. 84% thought lenders should help countries struggling with debt by cancelling or reducing or renegotiating repayment terms. So the challenge to us is to make multilateralism work for people. And the danger is New York has always seemed a long way from real people, other than those brash, noisy New Yorkers who will be full complaint and next week. And you look at the preparations that the president is struggling with, of the preparations for the SDG Midway Review Summit next week, and we see it mired in old procedural disputes, old red lines around what can and can't come into a General Assembly resolution, which cuts completely at odds to what this poll is demanding, which is make the UN relevant, have it deliver results, put bread on people's table, put healthcare into their communities, create jobs and opportunities for their future. And so I hope the delegates, as they gather next week, will put aside the petty wrangling, the diplomatic procedural disputes, and remember the call of those 36,000 people sampled in this poll for, whether it is in their national government or in multilateral government, relevance, purpose, and results. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Ellen, can we turn to you?
Thanks. Let me say how pleased I am to be here and to thank the Open Society Institute and Mark, and to thank the International Peace Institute and Zeid for calling us all friends together to talk about things that we all think about all the time. Today, we find ourselves at a critical juncture in human history. The convergence of crises we face, ranging from the recent pandemic to geopolitical tensions, the climate emergency, and the recent advancements in artificial intelligence, has brought forth a new era of challenges that demand immediate attention from nations and from people. The speed and complexity of these challenges have tested the resilience of states and international institutions alike. We have witnessed the weaponization of data and new technologies as competition in global domains, particularly cybersphere, continues to intensify in the face of these interconnected challenges. It is imperative that we strengthen our commitment to inclusive multilateralism. We need also to ensure that this inclusiveness recognizes that no single country or organization can address these challenges alone. It calls upon us to embrace diversity, foster cooperation, and engage all relevant stakeholders in the decision-making processes. By doing so, we can harness the collective wisdom, resources, and expertise of nations, civil society, and the private sector to find comprehensive and sustainable solutions. To strengthen inclusive multilateralism, we must first acknowledge the interdependence of our world. The challenges we face do not respect borders or boundaries. They transcend political ideologies, nationalism, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Therefore, our responses must also transcend these divisions. We must forge partnerships and foster collaboration that goes beyond traditional alliances, incorporating diverse perspectives, diverse political systems, and experiences from all corners of the globe. Furthermore, we must ensure that our multilateral institutions are fit for purpose, as Zeid has just said, in this rapidly evolving landscape. They must realize the existing of structures and processes of the global financial architectural system and the global peace and security system as having resulted in inequities and injustices. They must be agile, responsive, and inclusive. We need to enhance the capacity of these multilateral institutions to address these emerging challenges and bridge the existing gaps in governance. This includes fostering innovation, leveraging the potential of new technologies, such as AI, to tackle complex problems and promote sustainable development. At the heart of inclusive multilateralism lies a commitment to leave no one behind. We must prioritize the most vulnerable and marginalized populations who often bear the brunt of these interconnected challenges. By empowering women, youth, and marginalized communities, we can unlock their potential as agents of change and ensure that the benefits of progress are shared by all. In our pursuit of inclusive multilateralism, we must pay particular attention to the empowerment of women. Gender equality and the full participation of women in decision-making processes are not only fundamental human rights, but they are also key drivers of sustainable development and peace. When women are given opportunities to contribute, whether in politics, diplomacy, or peacekeeping efforts, they bring unique perspectives, skills, and experiences that enrich our collective decision-making processes. Their inclusion fosters more comprehensive and effective solutions to the challenges we face. Yet despite that progress in recent years, and despite all that we've done to open, gender disparities persist in all spheres. Women continue to face barriers, discrimination, and violence that hinder their full participation. It's our duty, your duty, to help dismantle these barriers and create an enabling environment to empower women to thrive and lead. And I'm particularly glad to hear the President of the General Assembly just tell us how he's going to help us to address these and to ensure that the equity for women will be profound in his leadership of the Assembly over the next few years. In the context of strengthening inclusive multilateralism, we must also ensure that all voices, women and youth voices, are heard, and their perspectives are integral to the decision-making processes. This means increasing the representation of women in international organizations, peace negotiations, and diplomatic efforts. In conclusion, let me say that the strengthening of inclusive multilateralism requires a collective effort, unwavering commitment, bold action. The challenges we face may appear so daunting, but there's also the opportunities that exist to lead us all to come together, to transcend our differences and ensure that our diversities are seen as an opportunity to build a more resilient and inclusive world. Let us seize this moment to forge new alliances, deepen existing partnerships, harness the power of multilateralism to address the interconnected challenges of our time. Together, I believe we can address these complexities of a changing world political order. Together, we can build a future that is much more just, sustainable, and prosperous for all people, a people for whom we all strive to ensure this better world. I thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And we now turn over to Maritza. Maritza, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to see so many people just at the beginnings of the what is going to be a hectic week full of stress. But we are gathered here today to discuss one of the most important issues for small states and how relevant we can be at the United Nations. We can be small but mighty, and Costa Rica is an example of that. Just yesterday, the ambassador of Singapore tweeted a photo of 5 member states, the 5 permanent representatives of Jordan, Liechtenstein, Singapore, Switzerland, and Costa Rica. And that photo, for those of you who have been around here for a while, reminded us of the small 5. The small 5 was a small group of countries founded by one of the persons seated on this table, at this table. And they were bold, prepared, and ready to face the imbalances of power that we face at the United Nations every day. The small 5 was a counterpower to the P5, and it shows the power of small states when we work together addressing the working methods of the Security Council, for instance, and later on to revitalize the work of the General Assembly. But we can be empowered and empowering. And our size does not determine our policy incompetence or our policy inability to enact change in the United Nations. In fact, the UN is comprised mostly for small and medium-sized states. And we must not forget that, because when we work together, change happens. So I want to repeat something that my previous speaker said. The Charter of the United Nations says we the peoples. It doesn't say we the P5, and it doesn't say we the member states. It's we the peoples. And since the Millennium Summit, we have worked the small states together, not only with the small five, trying to improve the working methods of the current Security Council, but also in other initiatives. It was because of the collective work of small states that we got the Amsterdam Treaty, and we have to acknowledge the great role that the CARICOM member states play during the adoptions of a first legally binding treaty that addressed or created standards for the transfer of weapons when there wasn't anything related to that. There were more controls to export wheelchairs than to send weapons or ammunition as well in the world. When I returned to the UN in 2020, I saw this renewed, reinvigorated role of small states at the United Nations. One of their examples was the electronic voting during the pandemic. And it's because of the electronic voting proposal and resolution that we passed is that the United Nations can be active at all times. We can vote even though the headquarters is closed due to another pandemic. And believe me or not, there's gonna be another pandemic. It's a matter of time. And I have worked with several people here on pandemic preparedness because there's another pandemic just around the corner. The other resolution that we passed, and it's a tribute to the work of small states, is the resolution to the recognition of the access to clean, healthy, and sustainable development as a human right. The other one was the request to the ICJ to provide an advisory opinion on state obligations concerning climate change. And that resolution was passed by consensus. Alongside Denmark, Costa Rica has worked on the Unmute campaign. And the Unmute campaign is crucial because with the pandemic, the doors of the United Nations were closed, not only to delegates, but to civil society. And CSOs are our partners. They are here to support us, particularly to the small delegations that do need their advice. And CSOs, I encourage you, if you are here today, to approach the small delegations from your regional groups and advise them on issues that are very complex, and they do need your expertise. Because at this stage, the complexity of the negotiations or conversations that we're having at the UN are so heightened by complexity and technicalities that many delegations, particularly small ones, are left out of the conversation. And this is the case of in ICTs, cybercrime, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapon systems. This takes me to even drones and all these emerging technologies. And that is very concerning because if we do not engage in these conversations, we will be too late. Actually, we are too late. Artificial intelligence is advancing at a staggering rate. Today, most advanced AI models use 5 billion times the computing power cutting-edge models from a decade ago. Processing that once took weeks, now happens in seconds. No technology is more powerful to become so accessible, so widely, so quickly. AI is a dual-use technology, having both military and civilian applications, and boundaries have become blurry between safely civilian and military destructive. All it takes is just one malign model to wreak havoc. Farther on the horizon looks the promise of artificial general intelligence that distill a certain point where AI exceeds human performance and of any given task, and the peril that AI will become self-directed, self-replicating, self-improving beyond human control. And believe me or not, that the region that is at the forefront of the efforts to address AI and autonomous weapon systems is my region, Latin America and the Caribbean. Just in February of this year, we gathered in San Jose with the 34 member states of the GRULAC region and adopted the Belém Communiqué that is asking for a legally binding treaty on autonomous weapon systems. And last week in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, I was invited to participate in the CARICOM conference on the human consequences of autonomous weapon systems. And that declaration, the declaration of Port of Spain, it's more advanced, more far-reaching than the one we adopted in San Jose. And both declarations or communiques are urgently calling for a legally binding treaty on autonomous weapon systems. Time is of the essence and we're lagging behind, in particular the global south. And if small states do not take steps, we are going to be left out of the conversation. If you read the latest article on foreign affairs, you will know that the US Congress is not even abreast with what's happening in regards to artificial intelligence. And imagine what we are doing at the global south. And I'm very happy to see with the veto initiatives that small states are taking and are willing to take more steps and more ownership when it comes to international peace and security. There are no governance frameworks when it comes to AI, autonomous weapon systems, drones, and so many other things that the conversations here are binded by the rule of consensus sometimes. And one of the recommendations, if we are to advance, is that we do need to seriously take a look at the rule of consensus here at the UN. For me, unlocking the courage and the wisdom of small states is key to preserve the credibility of the United Nations. We need fair, open, and inclusive appointment processes, and that is something that small states are also requesting. And I want to close reminding us a quote that inspires me every day. Never doubt what a small group of thoughtful and committed individuals can do, can change the world. In fact, is the only thing that ever has. Challenge the notion that might makes right. We can be small, but significant. I thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. Now we turn to Magna. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I just want to start with, I think, I think the speakers before me have made obviously very, very strong and very clear points on something that we all know at this point. I think at this point in time, we're at a point where we're like on a burning ship and people are fighting about who controls the rudder, because we've got all the warning signs that we could have ever asked for. We've just gone through a pandemic that is still devastating people's lives. We're seeing, horrendous conflicts in some parts of the world. We're facing a climate emergency that, as the poll shows, there's widespread recognition of the anxiety that it's causing all over the world. And yet we're at a stage where it seems like the multilateral system is just not responding. And people are fighting over the most trivial things rather than the things that matter. And at that point, I thought I'll start on a depressing note and then try and end on a hopeful note. So I'll start with the depressing note first, which is picking up from Lord Malloch-Brown's, one of the findings of the poll, which is that people, though they really value human rights, feel that the human rights system is ultimately not protecting them and their families. And that is a very depressing starting point in the year that is the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because the people who were there 75 years ago looking at the multilateral system and drafting that declaration were drafting it not for a world where we were having that discussion now. So something has gone horribly wrong. And I'm going to try and pick up what that is. And I think I'll start at a point that might be unusual for a human rights activist, but that this reflects to a large extent a failure in a dominant narrative that we have not tackled. And I think I just want to stress and thank Open Society Foundation for the poll that you have conducted, because I have to say, for activists, you have given us enormous ammunition. So thank you very, very much, because what your poll has done is shown us exactly, it's given us a lot of evidence to contest that dominant narrative. And I want to be clear about dominant narratives. Dominant narratives are sustained and perpetuated. They don't just materialize out of nowhere. They are a reflection of power, who holds it and how they use it. And that's what we are seeing at the moment. So let's start with the first most important one from my perspective. The poll completely shatters the myth that economic, social, and cultural rights are only prioritized by people in low and middle income countries. Let's just pause there for a minute, because this dominant narrative is something that anyone working on human rights has encountered for at least the last 30, 40 years. We've all heard it. It's dictated campaigns, it's dictated state responses, it's dictated everything that we have dealt with. And it turns out it is a myth. So how did this myth, how did it happen? How was it come? It's very powerful. It was maintained for years to justify the marginalization of these rights. And that marginalization was just not in just the spaces where discussions were happening. It was in how these rights were treated by the entire multilateral system. So economic social rights issues were marginalized and sent off to, but that's a development issue, and that should be talked about from a charity lens. What do you mean international cooperation and assistance is an obligation? It's not an obligation. Yes, the wording exists in the treaty, but they're so vague, that treaty, let's not bother with it. I mean, the consequences of that, it was, of course, a reflection of Cold War politics, but the consequences of that are visible in the poll. When the poll talks about the importance of global inequality, and it says people's priorities are things like food, it is a failure of the multilateral system to address issues that matter on a day-to-day basis to people, to developing countries, to address these in the same way that we also needed to address civil and political rights. It reflects in the finding that people think that human rights are applied selectively. That has unfortunately been the reality of where we are. And as I said, issues like food insecurity, and it's fascinating and very depressing to see the data on food insecurity in developed countries, but not surprising again for activists who say, actually, there's a lot of commonality in the experiences of people who experience marginalization, whether they're in the global north or they are in the global south. I just also want to briefly flag and make a quick pitch for research that we did, just to sort of actually echo the findings, which was also funded by the Open Society. So the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which I work at, which is a very small organization, but is the first international NGO that began work on economic, social, cultural rights. We did a research on rights-based narratives in South Africa, working with the social movement, Fight Inequality Alliance, and an academic center, the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Actually, we found very similar, in fact, even stronger findings, of course, but not that poll size, which is that 80% of the people who were surveyed in the survey that we undertook found that rights are a very important tool to make society fair. 90% believe that the government should provide more money for public services. So these are key findings. However, there were some complications in terms of the work, which is that where they were split is whether the government has control over the economy. And less than half of the people thought the government should actually reduce inequality through how it spends resources. And this takes us back to a dominant narrative. And that dominant narrative there is about the role of the economy. So I want to bring this back to then what this means in terms of the multilateral system and what human rights advocates want to see, or social movements, many others, not just people working on human rights, but those working on economic justice, on climate justice, want to see in terms of shifts in the multilateral system. The multilateral system can't just be invigorated. It can't just work better. I think it's IPI that said it perfectly. It's now about the purpose of the system. What role does it serve? That is the key issue. And ultimately, the multilateral system can only be effective on issues if it results in a shift in power and a shift in resources. They're both equally important. Now, interestingly, we saw that there is more willingness, it seems, from people in the polling to actually enable shift in resources. But again, I pause there. I'm just saying it so casually. For years, our campaigns have been handicapped. I have sat in numerous meetings, including with donors, and been told, well, this is very important, but we can't work on it because there's no public support in the global north to allow taxpayer money to be spent on debt relief or and forget the issue of reparations for climate, because that's absolutely impossible and on the table. And it turns out actually people do support it. So I think these are really important findings, but these findings, even though they are really important, are not going to translate into actual change unless something more changes in this process. And that is, I think, just I want to point that out because we are really in a very critical window of time. There's actually a really interesting convergence between civil society groups and governments, and I think all governments, not just developing country governments, that the next 3 years are a critical window of time. There are numerous opportunities on the table to reform the multilateral system, to reform international financial architecture, as Her Excellency has mentioned. But what kinds of reforms are undertaken is key. The Center for Economic and Social Rights just did a massive consultation by our standards for our strategy, where we had groups from all over the world participating. And what was interesting is that there is a real convergence across all of these very diverse civil society groups and social movements on the fact that this is a critical window where we want the change, and the change has to happen on these two, but it cannot be superficial change. And I think this is an important shift that we need governments to make. It's not enough to go in and tinker at the edges. It's not enough to just do some very small changes. What we have to do is go to the models themselves. And just to give an example, I think from the one that Her Excellency Maritza Chan has pointed to, on artificial intelligence, are we going to have safeguards, or are we going to question the very model that assumes the market will deliver technology that benefits human interests? Let's pause again. When has that happened last? But if that is the working assumption, and the role of the international community is to come up with safeguards, we are again chasing rather than determining what occurs. And all of this is manifest many, many times. So I think I just want to point out there that what we need to get at is a narrative of scarcity. There is a very predominant narrative of scarcity that is deliberately being maintained at the moment that speaks to the fact that the resources don't exist. They can only be galvanized through the private sector. They can only be galvanized by de-risking, by incentivizing private sector investment, et cetera. This is completely at odds with what the poll has effectively, I think, shown. It's effectively at odds with what we need at the moment. We need more public finances. We need multilateral systems that are going to support a real distribution of resources, both within and between countries. And we need a multilateral system that is not captured, which is the perception of many movements who don't want to engage with a system that is seen as captured by companies rather than by the interests of people that it's meant to be serving. So just on the last thing, on the note of hope, in the civil society movement, we are seeing remarkable collaboration. We're seeing people breaking silos. We're seeing people working in ways that people could not have imagined ever before. You can have a highly technical tax justice group working with the mass movement, working on environmental issues. People see tax, debt, and climate as closely linked. But we need the multilateral system also to break the silos. What we find when we come into the UN spaces is we're told, if you're going to bring up tax in relation to climate finance, this is the wrong body. You have to go and talk in X committee or in the other spaces. If you try and bring up debt in relation to the human rights bodies, well, actually now, thankfully, governments are, this is still the wrong spaces. We cannot afford this kind of splitting up. We can't afford the complexity, which is defeating, in fact, what we really need to come to, which is the core reform of the system, really to deliver on what people need at the moment. And I think the poll offers us a lot of ammunition, as I said, to build on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. With the permission of the audience, I would like to frame the first question, and then I'll open the floor. And because I can't resist this, I mean, listening to the panelists and to the first presentation by Mark, one can't but help draw some basic conclusions. One is that contradictions abound. And at the same time, we see entropy and a withering of parts of the global system. We see strengthening in other parts. Of course, the High Seas Treaty was negotiated not long ago at COP15. New targets for biodiversity were agreed upon. So the picture is always mixed. And it goes to also the point you were making, Meghna, on rights. It's, of course, a glaring contradiction that the major guarantor of rights is not the UN system, it's the states. But the states are the major threat to rights as well. And you have both the wolf and the fence as the same thing. And that's the oddity of the system we have. I think one of the amazing things that listening to the panels brought to me, and I'd like your reactions to this, Mark, the figure you presented on this demographic of 18 to 35 supporting authoritarian rule by 57%, I think is astonishing. I mean, it speaks to some sort of massive failure, either in education or in the strength of social media, but I still don't believe that it can overcome a basic sort of history or understanding of global history. I mean, no one ought to assume that tyranny is good, and authoritarianism opens the door to it. And how many times do we have to live that experience? But likewise, there is this sort of strange thing happening in the multilateral system. I was in a meeting, and speaking to Maritza's point and Meghna's point, I was in a meeting with AI thought leaders and discussing the new regulation to come. Not one person mentioned the UN, not one. What they assume, and it's a derivative of what we've seen in the Security Council over many years, they assume that GX, and X to be determined, now you're afraid to say 20 or 7 because the number is going to be variable, but some group will cook it in the kitchen and bring it to the rubber stamp, which is the UN. That the UN will not be the kitchen where this is, and the ingredients are put in, and this is discussed. And it's a sort of variation of what we see with the youth abandoning a notion that democracy and the participatory rights are something important to them. I wonder whether we can talk to this, because I think if we think that small groups are the ones that are going to solve the collective problems of today, then clearly we're going to leave small states out of it, and we're going to leave civil society out of it, and we're going to only put ourselves in a worse situation. Am I wrong in making that claim or assumption? And I'm going to turn to Mark. Being a professor at the law school, this is what we normally do. So we volunteer an opinion.
Well, look, I mean, I think the two variables that determine support for multilateralism are democracy and small countries. You know, I think you can make the case that both have been the drivers. And, you know, actually, the history is of small countries, whether it is introducing a resolution to insist on a General Assembly vote after any use of the UN veto, or that was many years ago, the countries that combined around landmines or other initiatives. There has been plenty of example of selective countries leading on issues and then bringing them to the UN, and more often than not, small countries or democratic countries. So I don't think we want to rule out that sort of initiative. I don't think it's always wrong if the cooking doesn't happen at the UN. It can be, frankly, better if it happens elsewhere on occasion. But what I think we do have to deplore is the declining authority of the UN and importance in world affairs. And, you know, this is a trend which has been going for several decades now, and sadly, arguably appears to be accelerating. And, you know, I think this year's General Assembly, by focusing on this rebuilding trust issue, will make a determined effort, I'm sure, to reverse that. But you know, I think Zeid, ultimately, whether it's young people having a caution about democracy as a means to solve their problem, or states and peoples losing confidence in the UN, you know, it is the same route. Deliver for us, deliver for us. And institutions that cannot respond to that are going to be challenged. And I know you've kept open, you were threatening me with this page in the poll, which shows, you know, Bangladesh, sort of a lot of people in Bangladesh being happy to accept military rule, despite a terrible history of military governments in Bangladesh. But you've got a country where it's been very hard in recent years for a democratic opposition to organize itself, or you know, to the ruling party. Or you look at other states like Egypt, where actually an overwhelming majority of people want to return to democratic rule, or South Africa, where people don't want to give it up despite the challenges it faces. So I think each of these countries where we surveyed has its own story of its relationship with democracy. But the root in each case is it delivering choice for us? Is it delivering security for us and our families?
Would anyone like to jump in? Okay. So shall I, President Sirleaf?
I tell you, Zeid, that I don't know, whatever the poll says, I think it's very clear that at the level of the ordinary person, whether it's at the state level or it's at the international organizational level, is that the system has failed to deliver the basics to enable them not only to survive, but to enable them to have ownership in those processes. And so, why? Simply because the resistance to change, the resistance to inclusion, to enable the participation in those things that affect the lives of people, is what is now bringing those that are resisting traditional norms, are resisting all the principles of democracy to which they had adhered over the years. And this is why, for example, in Africa, we see a reversal to authoritarianism, which is no solution to the problem. But unless the leadership at both the international level, the UN, for example, the United Nations, which must set the tone and which must be able to guide the processes, unless that happens, and that also is carried on to the state, which itself, and unless there's a compact between those who govern and the governed, so that each one feel that there is a common agenda, a common purpose, and equity prevails. That's not to say there will not be differences at income levels, you know, at levels of capacity. But at the end of the day, that common objective of being able to make that I believe in what we're doing and I'm a part of it. So it's that has to be addressed if you're going to be able to see this renewal of the strength of democracy, the renewal.
So is it, I mean, listening to the two of you, and I've said this in the past, because one cannot help but feel that we don't really have a polycrisis. In actual fact, I think it's a silly word, that we really have one crisis, and that is the crisis in leadership, yes, which then manifests itself in everything that we see, in pandemics, in rules that are set long time ago, in customary rules that are not met, in obligations to peoples that are not met. And so the crisis, the root is the same. And that's what you're essentially saying, I think. that it's the same basis where, and the manifestation of it comes out in different forms. But it's one crisis that we're facing.
That's correct.
Yeah. Meghna, I think you're itching to speak, so I can see you looking at me. So, but then I'd like to turn it over to the audience first. Yeah. Okay, go to the audience first. Okay, please.
My name is Bruce Knopf, and I'm the president of Citizens for Global Solutions. This is the American branch of the World Federalist Movement. And for 75 years, people like Albert Einstein and many others have said that we need a democratically elected world governance body that can pass legislation that sticks, that is enforced by judicial systems like the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. And we feel that that is what we need to do to solve the problems we're talking about. I'm also a trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and they have asked the UN, as many other organizations have done, to repurpose the Trusteeship Council to focus just on climate change. And hopefully this body would also have the authority to make their decisions stick and find ways to make nations abide by the rules that they establish. And I'd like your response to that.
Maybe we take one or two questions and then return to the panel. And yes, sir. Please.
During so-called perestroika in Russia, Gorbachev time, and after, when Yeltsin came to power, about 70–80% of people in Russia believe in democracy and was ready to die on barricades for democracy. Right now, according to your survey, Russia in the very end, something 35%. And I even was surprised. I would not be surprised it would be 10%, because Moscow believes they're already not in Russia. Most simple answer, authoritarian Kremlin and Putin suppress democracy. There is no opposition. But during Soviet time, even under Brezhnev, pressure was much stronger and cruel on any opposition. And at this time, for 80% of Russians, and not only Russian, and not former Soviet republics, strongly believe that to be connected to Western civilization, to Western democracy, to capitalism, it would be greatest benefit for country. So it would be very simplistic to explain everything only by Kremlin and Putin. No question, they contribute, but it would be very simple to find answer what is going on, not only according to survey, but what every day we see on TV, what we read in newspaper, to find only one side responsible. Because when so-called democracy, with Jeffrey Sachs, with everybody else who came to Russia to give advice, and Yeltsin would never give a power to any ministry, would no one appointment would go without consultation with American embassy. And results, whole national wealth was stolen.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So
you got the idea.
We've got the point. Can we take one more question and then we come back? Yes, Frank, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laurel Fletcher. I'm a human rights professor at University of California, Berkeley. And I have a question particularly for Malik Brown, but would like to hear others' views on this. In the forward, you say that Open Society Foundations are working to support the ecosystem of democratic norms and institutions. And given the shifts that have been announced in the funding priorities, I wondered if you could expand about what this means for civil society, particularly in the Global South and in countries that are struggling against rising authoritarianism, and linking this to some of the broader themes about how to take advantage of the next 3 years and who is going to lead the human rights movement really setting that up for the future, because disinvestment in the global South at this time seems to me to be one of particular urgency and concern. So invite responses.
Okay, so thank you for the three questionnaires, I suppose is how we call them. So who would like to handle the different questions? I can handle the first one if you'd allow me to, but then so the first question is an intriguing one, because there is a body of law which is enforceable in all courts, not second-guessed by parliaments, no invocation of sovereignty. And it's a body of law that emerges out of ICAO, as I understand it, the International Civil Aviation Organization. When once the body accepts certain new regulations, we all accept them a priori almost. Why? Because none of us want to step on a plane that then crashes into another plane when it crosses a border. So we accept it. You know, in that instance, we accept a loss of sovereignty for the sake of mobility and trade and well-being and just the sheer excitement of going to another country. 1.3 billion people do it every year. So we accept it. So why can't we see this planet as a traveling body around the sun in space? And for its well-being, certain things we have to give up certain amount of sovereignty for and just put it into being. And I shouldn't be doing this. It's an abuse of my authority, and you can take me to task. But I have, and not on behalf of IPI, I produced together with a colleague at IPI, though, an article on global carbon pricing, on setting a floor for it. And I think it's very much in sync with the times, but it speaks to that way of thinking. So thank you for the question. We then had a question on how we view the statistical data in light of the complexities of each situation. And of course, Russia was mentioned, that we can too often assume more casual sort of understandings, Mark. And so I don't know if you would like to address that, perhaps.
Well, I'm happy to. I mean, as I say, I actually think that you look at these numbers and you can actually see the sort of genealogy behind each one, the experience of democracy, the disappointments, the setbacks, the rise of authoritarian rule, its relative success or failure. And, you know, in the case of Russia, you know, the early euphoria and enthusiasm for democracy was, you know, punctured by what happened. But, you know, you look at Russia today and the numbers show that, you know, few Russians are confident that some sudden calling of elections would resolve the issue the country faces. And indeed, you know, while it's an uncomfortable fact for many of us appalled by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the fact is, in many ways, the regime in Russia remains much more popular and enjoys more support. And if there is a threat to it, it comes from the nationalist right rather than from the liberal left. So, you know, I think there is a story around each of these numbers. And, you know, as a student of international affairs, I went through each of these to make sure that there were no, you know, absolute anomalies. And there are one or two, but you haven't found them yet. So I'm not going to help you.
I found one.
I'm not going to help you with it. So there we are. There's the answer.
And Laurel's question on OSF.
Yeah. Well, look, on the question on OSF, you know, you should understand the reorganization is about one thing. Human rights have become a peacetime general's pursuit. We looked at a lot of deserving organizations around the world that we wanted to give resources to because they were doing good things in their country. Today, we're on a war footing because human rights is under threat around the world and democracy is under threat. We're not going to spend less, we're going to spend more. But we're going to spend it in ways that we are convinced is going to reverse the threats to human rights and democracy. Now, we're a wealthy foundation, but we're just a foundation in a world of states and their armies and of massive economic power that states and corporations can mobilize. So, you know, the fact that we're rededicating ourselves to the fight for democracy and human rights shouldn't make people relax and say, gosh, now it'll go the other way. It's going to be much more challenging and much more long-term than that. But, you know, to all our civil society friends around the world, you know, they should look at this as a reaffirmation of our support, not some withdrawal of it. We're changing our spending balances. You know, we spent a lot in Europe. We want to spend still a lot in Europe, but we want to free resources to spend more in the global South, because we think, you know, that has got to be a priority for us. So, you know, behind the changes lies a strategic determination to take on the enemies of democracy and human rights around the world in ways effective to today, a world where, frankly, a world to some extent governed by that old narrative that you so properly put down, but nevertheless, a narrative which at least purported to be about values has been replaced by a narrative about interests, and where we're dealing with nation states which brush off stuff that at least in the past would have embarrassed them, or where a US government will put alliances around energy security or opposition to Russia's behavior in Ukraine ahead of a country's human rights performance or democracy performance. So we're dealing in a much more complex new environment. And I would also just echo one where, as an old development person like you, Meghna, I'm just thrilled that finally economic and social rights are getting their moment. I'm not sure whether it's in the sun, that may be the wrong phrase, but at least getting the recognition they properly deserve.
Meghna, you're ready to pounce. I mean, in a good way. In a good way.
I'm having anxiety about the people with the questions who still haven't had a chance. But I mean, just I think picking up, I think Lawrence's question, but also I think linking to the points earlier. I mean, obviously we need more information. I think that's clear on this sort of data that's come back with about the youth, and I could just put my own beliefs there. So we need more data to understand and to sort of go deeper. But we do know that when people are anxious, and in fact, I think there's a danger, in fact, that, and you know, something that we're looking quite a lot in our narrative works and many other partners are, we actually reinforce that sense of anxiety, of hopelessness. And at that point, people do turn to a sense of, you know, unfortunately feeling like, well, actually, yeah, well, maybe that person doesn't value democracy, but they're going to get the job done, as you said. So I don't know, I wanted to be interesting to explore, because we do know amongst the youth, there's much higher levels of anxiety about climate, for example, and there is a big generational difference on that. So I think it'll be interesting to look into that, but also in some of the countries that we've just talked about. I just want to pick up this point of, I think, who will lead? And I think this is where we do have to also acknowledge the complexity of the time that we're in. So in our strategy, for example, our overarching goal is to look at supporting cross-movement mobilization towards rights-based agenda for transformation of the global economic system. Because really, that's what we think civil society is talking about when they're talking about the kinds of reforms that are necessary. And that this really has to be a mixture of insider and outsider tactics. I've been sitting in a lot of groups strategizing with people, and it's very clear that some of the models that we've used in the past just don't work anymore. We can't just rely on a group of champion states, though I would say that I think the small states are key because they're where the energy lies. We can't rely on just this sort of insider advocacy. We are looking at a mixture here. The social movements, the sort of mass public mobilization that we're seeing in countries is key. It's very difficult to draw those connections, but this 3-year window is key. And that's why we need to sort of change the rules. None of us can afford to do what we have been doing so far. We need a different agenda. And I think just on that point, I think to echo Lawrence's point, we need donors who are willing to support that kind of collective cross-movement mobilization, which is a very different model from what we've had before. And we need support for states as well, because there's small groups of states who are trying many new things, but it is very difficult and they lack resources.
Thank you, Meghna and Maritza. And we've gone past cocktail point. We can maybe take 1 or 2 questions and then we'll have to sort of suspend, but it's such a rich discussion. So please, Maritza.
I just wanted to say that the problems of democracy are only solved with more democracy. And the question is not seeking alternative forms of governance at the national or international level. It's about ensuring that the existing systems operate efficiently and fulfills its commitments. And to that, we need to go back to basics. We need to practice what we preach. We need to back our words with tangible actions and allocate our resources accordingly. And it takes me to my second point. It is our responsibility as individuals to lead. Many of the problems we're facing today at the national and international level, it's because the most qualified, the most brilliant people have decided not to engage in politics, join foreign services for the foreign services of the country, or step aside from the international national realm. It is on us. It's our own responsibility that we have leaders that are weak, that are not able to foresee the future, or that are not responding to the needs of their constituencies. And what we need is collaborative and servant leadership. And in Spanish, we have a difference between a funcionario público and un servidor público. And I think that makes a whole of a difference, because when we are here to serve, when we understand that as international public servants, we are here to make sure that we foster the agendas and enact the agreements that we have made already and fulfill the promises and commitments that we sign on to. Pacta sunt servanda is the basis, but it is on us to work on improving not only democracy, but also ensuring that democracy comes to the United Nations, and it also comes to the election of the next Secretary General. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, one last question, and then we probably need to wind up. So yeah, I'm sorry to choose ahead of them. No, what? Constantina, one.
I think I just started speaking as a psychologist. I'm Dr. Yael Danieli. I represent the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, which you support. Thank you. So as a psychologist, to continue your analysis, part of your findings sound like unidimensionality versus complexity. And this is on all levels, right? Be it diversity, inclusiveness, small countries, big countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of it is, I believe, indeed, in reaction to the horribleness of the loneliness of COVID, and the sort of out of sheer fear to sort of cling to whatever there is. And that usually is one thing, not complexity. Yeah. That you need to take a step back and learn. And that leads me to the second point, which is education. It wasn't sufficiently mentioned. And I think it's really important, including education about what the United Nations is about. Yes. If people don't know, they don't know that it's a good thing. If they don't know that about human rights, they don't know whether it's good or bad. They just know this or that. Yes. And that has to do with people not knowing that they have rights. That's right. And this has been, as a victims' rights person, it's been plaguing me until I die. I want victims to know they have rights. Yeah. They don't. We know because we created them. But the real people who need to know, they don't know. So how do we reach out to them to let them know? And that would even maybe deter the perpetrators. And the last thing is, what do you think about the reform, the necessary reform of the Security Council?
So the big question comes at the end. So yeah, we're going to have to do another session, and I'm looking particularly at Samir Sambar and Maher Nasser from two leaders of UN DPI to answer that first question you had, and but it is a very serious question, of course, And there are others who have asked for the floor, and I must apologize. Please, we'll have a little reception now and cocktail session. And if you can address the questions to any of us, we will be here. But I must take this opportunity. I won't make closing remarks because we're over time, to thank the President of the General Assembly once again for his opening statement. Thank you, sir. And to the most distinguished panelists for sharing their views, and for Mark for sharing his report with us as well. So, and thank you to all of you for attending, and to the online audience for logging on. Thank you so much. Good night to all of you. Thank you.